So I don't know exactly who all was here Wednesday night, but I just want to let you know we witnessed a Christmas miracle here on Wednesday night. The entire congregation was seated in these two sections, nobody sitting in the wings. People actually abandoned their seats and scooshed to the middle. It was a Christmas miracle, all right? And we should try that more often. It was pretty cool. Let's see if I can find my, we may have a crisis. I can't find my glasses. So that's going to be fun. All right. So this week, well, just to be clear, in case anybody isn't aware, we're covering the 9 commandments that were repeated in the New Testament, and we've been working through them. This week we've come to "You shall not murder," right? And I think we mentioned last week that the first 4 commandments are about our relationship with God. They're about acknowledging God and understanding and honoring God. The 5th commandment is about honoring our parents. And I said that was kind of the fulcrum where you move from the focus as being on God to the focus being on other people, right? So this week we're going to start into the commandments that are about our relationship with others, other people in our community, in our sphere of contact, right? So if we look in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 13, extremely long reading, "You shall not murder." So pretty straightforward. I don't know if we want to have any comments about that, but I think we all understand that this is a prohibition against killing other humans. But there is a problem with that, in that statement, in that the old King James Version, the commandment was "Thou shalt not kill," right? And that translation has led to a lot of theories, conversations, thoughts that aren't necessarily bad, right? Aren't necessarily unscriptural. I don't know if that's the right way to say that. But there may be extra scriptural, right? Like to apply that standard of "thou shalt not kill," which is a very, very wide blanket, right? You run into some textual conflict with other verses, right? So I usually like to avoid talking about the vocabulary of foreign languages as it's been translated, but I think it's important with this to understand what that word means. And if you look, this isn't groundbreaking. There's plenty of scholarship on this. It's easily accessible. I'm going to go with the closest thing that I can pronounce as rasak. And this is a word that means unlawful killing, right? So it brings in its connotation that it's a killing of people, right? And that it's unsanctioned or unlawful. So anybody have comments about the difference between murder and killing as a translation? Okay. So as always, we ask, why did God give us this commandment, right? So we've seen what it is. Now we want to investigate why. Does anybody want to, before we dig into the verses, anybody want to hazard a guess why? Shirley?
We're taking the power of life away from God.
Okay. So
We're not.
God gave us life, and we didn't give ourselves lives, so our taking it is a form of theft. maybe? Is that fair? Or usurpation of authority, maybe?
Pardon me?
Taking of authority? Yeah, okay. Anybody else? Robert?
I mean, in certain cases, there may be a sense of executing judgment, which is reserved for God.
Okay. So putting ourselves into a judgment position that we weren't given?
Correct.
Okay. Well, how about we turn in our Bibles to Genesis chapter 9, 1 through 7. And while you get there, I'll say, I think both Robert and Shirley are correct. It's not the textual answer, but I believe that they are side connotations that do apply, right? So it's Genesis chapter 9, verse 1. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat the flesh with its life, that is blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning from every beast. I will require it from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man his blood shall be shed. For God made man in his own image, and you be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it. So we see in the text there, God's telling us we're not to kill other men because we're created in his image, right? So it's a violation of God's person in a way for us to take the lives of others. And if everybody's killing everybody, it makes it hard to fulfill these commandments of, right, multiplying and filling the earth, right? So you have to learn to get along to have that effectively happen, right? So I think it's important to note here, and I apologize, I'm going a little slower because I can't read. I can't see that. Oh, wait a minute. I found them. There we go. They were with me all the time. So I think it's important to note here that these verses in Genesis are recorded, not necessarily written down, but are recording events that occurred at least 1,000 years. It's actually like 1,050 according to the calendar I got, but I figure at those kinds of time scales, 50 years is dubious. But it's about 1,000 years prior to the issuance of the Ten Commandments that God is giving this command to man to honor the lives of other men, right? And I think that's important because in the previous weeks we've said, well, why did God reissue this command into the New Testament? And the answer was because God hasn't changed, right? So here we're looking at a justification for this commandment that's 1,000 years before the commandment is given. And that, to me, just illustrates very strongly the consistency of God's nature, right? So comments, thoughts? Everybody has a good concept of 1,000 years. You know how that would feel? It's like stuck in traffic on 77 North. It's like that. All right. All right, so we're going to look now at the first recorded murder. But I got to ask you a question. Was it really murder? If you look in Genesis 4:8, it says, Cain spoke to Abel his brother. When they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Then the Lord said to him, not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So we see here Cain, jealous of his brother's good favor with God, maybe upset because he got scolded by God, right? God told him that he could be okay. He said, just do right and everything is fine. But he had his feelings hurt, right? So then you get into people making a lot of assumptions isn't a nice word. I don't want to say assumptions, but filling in blanks that they don't have clear vision to. And talking about, well, Cain was just boiling with rage, and so he's plotting these opportunities to attack Abel, right? And the only thing that I think from all of that conversation, if you look out on the scholarship and the internet and in the books and things, you'll find it pretty easily. I think what we should look at, Keaton's not here, but we should look at outcome in this case, right? So we saw in Genesis, after this account, but before the Ten Commandments, God is saying, if you kill someone, your life is to be taken, right? And we just said that this shows the consistency of God, that God hasn't changed. So let's look and see what happens to Cain. He gets exiled, right? He gets sent away from the family. And actually somewhere it says sent away from the presence of God, which I thought was interesting, that, maybe God is still present in the garden and they still have some physical access to him, but that's a sidelight. But if you look in Exodus 21 and 13, you have the sort of finer details, right? Like the Ten Commandments are the high-level code, and then later in Exodus, you see more specific details. So if you look in Exodus 21:12, it says, whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. But if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. So we see here specific commandment or rule that says if it's a deliberate murder, death penalty applies. If it's something other, what we would maybe call manslaughter, then death penalty does not apply. So I don't know, you logic scholars tell me, is it incorrect to say that a very consistent God said to Cain, your punishment is not death, your punishment is exile, and in fact made it such that if someone did come to kill him, they would be punished 7 times, right? So is Abel's killing the first murder in the Bible?
First one we know of.
Is it a murder or is it manslaughter?
Well, I don't think that's for us to.
So murder requires the death of the murderer, right? Cain was judged by God, and
This is when.
so that's a possible point, Matt.
I'm sorry. I think about Abel too. So he was the start, right? He was the first killer. So we look in Hebrews 11:4, what came from Abel's death, right? Anybody has Hebrews 11:4? They want. Maybe you're going to get to that.
I'm not.
Okay. So Hebrews 11:4 talks about Cain killing Abel and what. Abel's life, he lives on because he was killed. And then you look at Jesus. He was killed. He was murdered. He was the last murder, but those were two important murders. Jesus was killed. He was murdered.
For sure.
And he lives on.
Okay. Matt?
I agree with that. You could also argue that the first murders were Adam and Eve, because Satan effectively caused them to sin, and the command.
Oh, long-term delayed murder. Okay.
Yeah, well, but the curse or the penalty for disobedience was death. And John chapter 8, verse 44, I think, where Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, but he's referring to the devil. But he says he was the liar, the father of lies, and a murderer from the beginning. And so that's interesting.
Yeah. I think that's the cunning piece in the lie, right? You shall not die, right? Well, it's a fine print clause kind of situation. You shall not die immediately, which is what you thought was going to happen, but you will die, right? So if y'all don't know, Matt's teaching Genesis on Sunday night, so he might be a little over-prepped on that. All right, so I don't think it's terribly important whether we label Cain's actions as murder or manslaughter, right? It's a historical fact. He killed his brother. We know what happened after that. But I do think it is interesting that the standard for murder wasn't applied in his case. In fact, kind of the opposite. Which, of course, applies to all of us in a way, right? Maybe not as obviously and directly as in this case, but what Keith was saying was that it's illustrative of God's mercy for man's failures, right? And I think even though it's a bad path, ultimately, God had plans for Cain, right? So he had things for Cain to do. Other comments, thoughts? All right, so, I should have read this, I apologize. So Exodus 21, oh, nope, I did read that. This is from the NET, we read it before, but the NET makes it a little bit more current English in that it says didn't lie, where it says in the ESV didn't lie for him, it says basically he didn't do it with premeditation, but it happens by accident. So it's just a little clearer in the NET that we're talking about a manslaughter type situation. All right, so let's look at a couple examples of murder in the Old Testament. 2 Samuel chapter 3, in verse 26, it says, when Joab came out from David's presence, he sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the cistern of Sirah, but David did not know about it. And when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into the midst of the gate to speak with him privately, and there he struck him in the stomach, so that he died, for the blood of Asahel his brother. Afterward, when David heard of it, he said, I and my kingdom are forever guiltless before the Lord for the blood of Abner the son of Ner. May it fall upon the head of Joab and upon all his father's house, and may the house of Joab never be without one who has a discharge, or who is leprous, or who holds a spindle, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks bread. So Joab and Abishai his brother killed Abner because he had put their brother Asahel to death in the battle at Gibeon. So what we see here is the tradition of the blood avenger, the avenger of blood system that they had. The younger brother of these two guys was in a battle, and Abner was, at least at that time, allied with King Saul, and there's a fight. Saul's team loses. Abner takes off, and he's running, and this young man is the fastest guy out there, and he's chasing Abner. Abner tells him a couple of times, hey, leave me alone, turn aside, turn aside. I don't want to kill you because I won't ever be able to look at your brother, Joab, right? So they had some kind of relationship, and this young guy's not having any of it. He's going to kill Abner because Abner is a very famous and renowned warrior, right? And Abner kills him right there. He dies. And Joab, being a big ally of David's, right? He thinks that he has the clearance, I guess, to kill Abner after Abner comes to David and makes peace or aligns himself with David. And that's why David proclaims the sort of curse that he does on Joab, right? So in a way, the killing was within the bounds of the law to a degree, but it wasn't acceptable because it wasn't authorized by the king, right? The king had other plans and had made a peace with this guy, and then it makes David look bad, right? That this guy came to make peace, and one of David's senior captains kills him, right? But so there we see an example of selfishness to a degree, right? This pridefulness amongst the family that we're going to get revenge on you, right? And it ultimately sort of boomerangs around negative for them, right? Thoughts on that? All right, so let's look in Numbers 25, verses 6 through 8, and then we're going to skip down 10 through 13. It says, and behold, one of the people of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman to his family in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the people of Israel, while they were weeping in the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose and left the congregation and took a spear in his hand and went after the man of Israel into the chamber and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman, through her belly. Thus the plague on the people of Israel was stopped. And the Lord said to Moses, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the people of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not consume the people of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore say, behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and his descendants after him the covenant of a perpetual priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the people of Israel. So, complicated story, but basically Israel was out of alignment with God. They've made an alliance with Midianite. They're marrying. They're involved in idolatry, and there's a plague. God sends a plague. Tells, I think it was Moses, to hang the leadership of the priests, right? And while all that's finishing up, they've hung all these people. It was a significant number of people that they killed already. Phinehas catches out of the corner of his eye somebody doing the same thing. So, hey, we just made this big example and you didn't get it, right? So Phinehas goes and he murders these two people, or he kills them, right? But unlike Joab, who received a curse for what he did, God himself says, Phinehas, you're fantastic, and I give you all these things. You're going to be part of the priesthood, and you're going to be blessed forever. So what's the difference? Very quiet. Come on, it's pretty clear what the difference is between the killing of Abner and the killing of these two people. Matt?
Well, they were sinning.
Okay.
And I don't know where in the Levitical law, but there was, God does specifically say you got to remove certain sins from the camp. And one example of that is in Joshua, after the Battle of Jericho, with Achan's sin. The whole nation of Israel was punished as they went to battle to this little fort, Ai, until they purged the sin from the camp. And God
Because of
says,
Achan,
hey,
right?
And God basically says, hey, you're never going to succeed until you purge the sin from the camp.
Right.
And so my take of this is that Phineas is effectively doing it.
Phineas is what?
Purging the sin from the
Purging the sin. Right. So, who told Joab to kill Abner? Joab decided that, right? He sends out a messenger, he calls him back, he makes the whole plot. It comes out of Joab's mind, right? He's going to get revenge for his brother. But here Phineas is acting on God's instruction. So he has the authority of a higher power that tells him that this isn't wrong, that this is okay, right? It was a righteous act. All right, so let's move now to the New Testament and look in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 14. It says, if you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because of the Spirit of glory and of God rest upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. So we don't see in the New Testament a direct giving of the command, thou shalt not murder, right? Once again, we're looking a little bit sideways into things, but Peter says don't be suffering. He's talking about Christians being persecuted by the government largely here. He's saying do suffer for being a Christian. Do be convictable because of your Christianity, but don't be any of these other things. So we know, and we're going to look at a bunch of other verses, but this is the verse that's the clearest, closest thing to thou shalt not murder, right? So what about those other verses? If you look in Matthew 19, 16 to 22, Luke 18, 18 to 23, Mark 10, 17 to 22, you see the story of the rich young ruler. And of course, it says very clearly there, thou shalt not murder. But like we talked about last week, this is Jesus alive prior to the crucifixion, living under the law of Moses, and talking to someone who is also under the law of Moses and telling them these are the things that the law says, right? So it's not Jesus giving a new commandment, right, which is ostensibly the name of this class, but rather it's Jesus teaching the old law, right, as he often did. However, in Matthew 5:21, right, Jesus speaking again, it says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to the judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to the judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. So here we see Jesus talking about murder, and I think the point that he's making here is this is a huge, glaring thing. It's a big sin. It's something that's in your face. So he's using that, arguing from the large to the small and saying, yeah, you thought that was a problem? That's a problem, but this little thing that you don't think is a problem is also to be considered, right? He's highlighting the fact that, you know, we see later that sin begins in the heart, right? So he's saying, if you have a small heart problem, stop it, fix it before it becomes something major. Really, what he's talking about is before it intervenes between you and God, right? Thoughts? Remarks? Kind of like he told Cain? Yeah. When he made a bad offering, he said, hey, I accepted your brother's offering because he made it from faith or from a good heart, right? So if you go and do good things, I'll accept your offering too, right? That's what he told him, paraphrase, right? So similar thing here is basically saying, hey, if you know you've got this conflict, go fix that before you come in front of me, right? Anybody else? Okay, well, let's hop over to Matthew 15, 18 through 20. It says, but what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, and slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone. And we see the same story in Mark 7:21. Apologize, my shoe has come untied. Can't be walking around with a flat tire. So here we have a list of undesirable sins. And I bring some of these things up because I don't want you to go away and say that, I said, well, it wasn't in the New Testament that we specifically were commanded not to murder. It's very clearly not acceptable, right? And then Romans 1, we're going to read several verses here, but we're going to kind of skip around. We're going to read 18 to 21, 28, and then 30 to 32. It says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. Slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. They know not God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die. They do not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. So, I think we see here the deeper mind of God on these topics, that it also, not only does it say if you do these things, but it wraps in approval of those who are doing these things, right? So why did God reiterate this in the New Testament? Anybody want to say it? We should probably all just say it in unison, right? Because God hasn't changed, right? We're made in his image, just as the same as the people who were born under the Old Testament law, right? However, like I told Robert this morning, this was a hard class or a hard lesson for me to get engaged on in the beginning, because I don't really think it's a problem for anybody here, right? I think y'all are good quality people. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, right? But sometimes it's difficult to teach on a topic where you don't necessarily feel like it's needed, right? But clearly, it's in the book. It's meant for us to consume it. So why do you guys think that we would need to have this rule repeated to us in the church? What's that, Keith? So it teaches us respect for life, yeah? So are there other kinds of murder besides the angry, hostile murder, right? Like Matt said, the long-term delivery, right? What about this verse that we just read? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, right? So we know that Jesus often taught that it wasn't necessarily the manifestation of a thing, it was the mere concept, right? The thought So wouldn't have to have actually killed someone to be guilty, right? I'm sorry, Chris, what?
That's kind of like what war is.
Okay. Well, we're going to get right there, so good segue.
And, in Romans 13, I believe, God commanded us to, do as the government that he put into place.
Okay.
But then in Ecclesiastes 3, it says that there's a time for everything.
Right.
And it gets down to time for peace, a time for war. And so war is the time that murder, which there is in that, whether it's right or wrong,
Right.
I think that's a time where it might be justified.
So way back at the beginning of the class, we talked about a Hebrew word, raksha, right? And it said that it was unlawful killing. That implies that there's lawful killing. If there's unlawful, there has to be lawful, right? And so we see that flow down from authority, right? Where does lawful begin? And it's because you have authority from the government, right? We're skipping ahead a little bit here, but so I was going to ask you guys, what do you think about the death penalty, right? And I think, how does the death penalty differ from murder? It's a little bit like the Joab-Abner versus Phinehas situation, right? In Joab-Abner, Joab decided on his own, because of his own pride, because of his own selfishness, to get revenge, right? In the case of Phinehas observed something that was an affront to God and acted out of obedience and honor to God, right? That authority was what made it lawful. So in much the same way, in a death penalty situation or a war situation, that's not necessarily an individual choosing their own benefit. I think a lot of times we worry that is the case, but in Romans 13:3, God says, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servants for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So we've seen God's told us twice in the Old Testament, more than twice, but twice we've seen today, that the penalty for murder is death. And here in Romans, we see God has authorized government to be his authority on earth, right? To carry out his wrath. So I think we can say that it's not against God's will to have the death penalty, right? I think we can also say that we don't necessarily have to carry that out on our time frame, maybe. We can argue, about God said that life will be taken for life, so maybe we should. But without trying to get too political in the class, I think we can show that there's a direct line from God that says the government has that authority, right? And then moving back to military service, the one thing I would say about military service is there's nothing in the scriptures that says you should join the Army, the Marine you'll be, right? But Paul in particular very frequently uses the metaphor of a soldier for Christians as soldiers, right? So there's clearly a respect that Paul has for soldiers and for military that I think if it were wrong to be involved with the military, to be at war. I don't think he would have written all of the things that he did. Just quickly, 1 Corinthians 9:7, who serves as a soldier at his own expense, who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit, or who tends a flock without getting some of its milk. Philippians 2:25, I have thought it necessary to send you to Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. 2 Timothy 2:3, share in the suffering as a good soldier of Christ. Philemon 1:2, and Epiphaia, our sister, and Archippus, our fellow soldier, and the church in your house. So you can see several times where Paul's drawing that language, and as I say, I just don't think he would so frequently use that metaphor if he thought there was a problem. Yes, sir.
Those verses you mentioned, in Luke chapter 3, John the Baptist is teaching people to repent and be baptized. You know, he's preparing the way for the Lord. And he's talking to the people, and he said, ye brood of vipers, right? Who warned you to flee from the wrath to come, therefore bear fruits worthy of repentance. So that's the context. And so then lots of different people came to him and said, well, okay, well, what should we do? You know, tax collectors came, scribes, but then likewise in verse 14, likewise the soldiers asked him, hey, what should we do? And if it was unlawful to be a soldier, then he would have said, hey, stop doing that. But he didn't do that because the context is repentance. Instead, what he says is, hey, do not intimidate anyone falsely, or and be content with your wages. So you can infer from that, I think, that it's not wrong to be a soldier.
I agree. Yeah. Go.
Acts 10, we can infer too, because Cornelius was picked out of all the people in the world who know Gentiles to be the first Gentile to be converted. Because he was the centurion for several men. So, yeah, I think it's pretty clear.
Yep. So we got 1 minute. Self-defense. Discuss. Shirley.
It also goes to the fact that we consider death just the taking of a life, but the Bible also talks about, you mentioned earlier, can kill people. So we have, it again shows the New Testament how much mercy is has. And we ought to control our tongue also as we speak about people, because that can kill them also, whether it's just a spiritual killing of them, so they have no reason to live and whatever like that, or building them up. And so that's something that plays into that. It says here in James 3, verse 6, and the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set upon its members, staining the whole body, and setting on fire the course of life, and set on fire by hell. For no human can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. So there are ways that we can kill someone spiritually or emotionally also, and God's interested in that. And the important reason is, if we speak kind to people, that way more readily help them to accept the gospel. And so that's the reason why we shouldn't use our tongue either.
Okay. Shirley.
Abortion.
Yes. Yep. That's definitely.
You know, it's either killing a child because it's inconvenient, but then there's the cases of aborting a child because to save the mother's life.
Mm-hmm.
That is very.
It's a quandary, yeah.
Very tough.
I think that doesn't happen all that often. I think that's the rarest of circumstances relative to the other choice, but yeah. All right, guys, a couple of things to think about. You see all these people that are applauding and celebrating the guy who shot the Pfizer CEO. I think we read a verse that says, you know, those that are supportive of people who are doing these things are also condemned, so I'd be careful with that. And I think Shirley hit on something about abortion that says we have a huge problem with murder in the U.S., and I think it's a cultural problem that starts because we don't value life from the very beginning. And if you don't value an infant who's done nothing wrong, it's very difficult for you to value others, right? So it's a cultural problem, and we have to start restoring God's desire and God's will for our relationship with other people. All right? Thank you very much. See you next week.